Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. Today I'm going to approach a topic that many of you have asked about, so thank you very much to those of you that have got involved in the comments. We're going to cover my Arcs of Omen matched play lists for 500, 1,000 and 2,000 points. Now, as it goes, it wasn't deliberate, but you could actually use these lists as a sort of scale up, because the units that are included in the 500 are all in the 1,000 and are all in the 2,000. And the same goes for everything that's in the 1,000 is in the 2,000. So you could scale them up if you wanted to. But one thing I will say is they are very Plague Marine heavy. Partly that's because of the free war gear on Plague Marines, giving them great versatility, particularly in 10-man squads. You can remove the models that are not going to be good in this area of the board, depending what units you're up against, and retain the models that have the profile that is going to be effective into those units. So not only do they have OBSEC and good durability to just play the primary, Death Guard have some good secondaries that the Plague Marines really support, being troops. They can offer you CP off the back of them. But on top of that, they're just flat good. So I'm not advocating anybody run out and buy a ton of Plague Marines, because firstly, I think the fact that they come in 7s isn't that consumer friendly, but I get it from a lore perspective, but I really wish they'd just sell them in 10s, even if they didn't come with 2 cleavers, 2 flails, and so on. I would still just appreciate them selling them as 10s, but hey ho. And on top of that, we don't know what's going to happen in 10th. Odds are 10th is going to be right round the corner in the next sort of 3 to 6 months. And although there's no confirmation of that, looking at how long editions last and the Royal Mails telling us that they've got a stamp coming out in June would suggest that the drop of 10th edition will be in June. And I personally am not rushing out to buy any more Plague Marines until I know what happens with that. But if you are in the position to already play these lists, then I would certainly recommend them, because I think they are fairly competitive. I don't consider myself a top competitive player, but I do play games to win, not always just to try something out. And when I'm playing these lists to win, it has resulted in that more often than not. So let's jump in and take a look at the 500 point list to begin with. So, of course, this is an Arcs of Omen detachment. The compulsory is troops, and we are literally only filling the compulsory single HQ and compulsory 3 troops. We're taking a Malignant Plaguecaster with Miasma of Pestilence and Putrescent Vitality for some buffing. We've got a 10-man Plague Marine squad, Plasma Gun and Power Fist on the Champ, 2 Blight Launchers, 2 Cleavers, 2 Flails and 2 Melters, and 1 Mason Axe. And then we've got 2 5-man Plague Marine squads. We've got a Plasma Gun and Fist on the Champ, 1 Blight Launcher, 1 Cleaver, 1 Flail, and 1 Melter Gun, and the other 5-man squad is identical. So the idea here, the 2 5-man squads can play the game for you. They can sit on an objective each and spread the sickness on it. So that's going to get you either 7 or 8 points, depending on the mission, whether the home objective is in your deployment or not. And that, as I say, is going to get you either 3 or 4 on the home objective, and then 4 on the one that's in no man's land. As well as just holding those objectives, trying to be obscured if it's possible. That's not always the case, depending how the terrain's laid out, but in cover at the very least. They're relatively durable at T5 and a 2-up save if they're in cover, so hopefully the opponent doesn't have the ability to commit enough firepower to wipe them out without considerable investment, to which you can then counter. So that then leaves the Plaguecaster and the 10-man squad. So the idea being, the 10-man squad has enough bodies that even if they lose a few, they're still going to be Lookout Sir in the Plaguecaster and letting him get his buffs off. The 10-man squad, of course, you've got that good mix of profiles in there, so if you're coming up against a big monster or vehicle, you of course keep the Cleavers and the Fist. If you're going to be coming up against an infantry squad, you would of course keep the Flails for those multiple attacks, 6 attacks each, at strength 5 AP 2 damage 2. So either way around, that 10-man squad is going to have profiles to work well into any opponent, and of course can push up towards the opponent to put pressure on them and force them into that engagement rather than coming for your backline. And if they do decide to come for your backline, by advancing up the board turn 1 with that squad and the Plague Caster, you may well be in a position to charge turn 2, if not another advance turn 2 for a charge into their backline turn 3 onwards. In terms of secondaries, before we do, so without any deadly pathogens, that list comes in at 470, and you could then, I like to slap on an acidic malady onto the Malignant Plague Caster's Corrupted Staff. I like to think of it as a poo on a stick. And so the acidic malady takes it to strength 8, AP 2, damage D3. So quite an interesting profile. It's going to get work done even against big monsters and vehicles. Not a ton of attacks, but D3 damage can come up clutch and really get the damage output there sometimes. So as we've said there, we've got two squads that are playing the primary and doing the Spread the Sickness. We know we're going to take Spread the Sickness in almost every game, as Death Guard is a fantastic secondary. And I will say, as much as it's perhaps a bit above the power level that many other factions can rely on for their secondaries, I do think out of any faction, Death Guard being largely so slow with the sorts of units that can complete secondaries, really they need at least one that's generous like that. Now, Fleeing Vectors can still be good in a 500-point game, depending what your opponent's running. If it's a Hordy list, then there is perhaps going to be enough models to get the 7 models killed each turn. But again, if we're talking maybe more MSU, which is minimum squad size, 5-man unit, Plague Marines, particularly the 10-man squad, are not going to have any trouble wiping a 5-man infantry squad. So you're not that likely to get the leadership failure out of that scenario, because you'll have probably killed the unit anyway. So with that being said, I don't think Fleeing Vectors is a great choice at 500 points, but I think Grind can be. Again, bearing in mind, if you're killing something with a troop choice, you'll get a CP, even if you don't successfully do the grind. So just killing something having taken grind is going to generate you potentially a CP a turn, which I think makes it a reasonable take, even if you don't think you're going to score that well on it. But again, with only 4 units in this list, there are plenty of other armies out there that will get more units in a 500-point list, and so grind could become quite appealing. Things like Assassinate and Bring It Down, not generally that good at scoring in a 500-point game, just because there's not going to be that many of those models, and I wouldn't really want to take a Psychic secondary. The point here of the Miasma and the Putrescent Vitality is that that always goes on the 10-man squad and helps keep them alive, because that is going to be the unit that the opponent tries to remove. At 500 points, unless they're pure gunline and they're really dedicated to wiping elite units, like the Plague Marines are, arguably, then they're going to struggle to remove the full 10-man squad. And as we've said, you just keep the profile that's going to be best into their army, and in theory, your output isn't diminished that badly. So that's the 500-point list. As I say, comes in at 485 if you do take Acidic Malady on the Plaguecaster. In the 1,000-point list, and as we've said, it does include the same units, just more units. So again, once again, we've got the Arcs of Omen detachment, and the compulsory is troops again. We've got the exact same Plaguecaster. Now, with the 500-point list, I opted to go with Third Plague Company and opted to take the Gloaming Blow on the Plaguecaster. You don't have to do that, but I do think denying rerolls is pretty reasonable at 500 points. That's one way that certain armies will look to force multiply. So denying both hit and wound rerolls shuts down things like Lightning Cores, as well as captains, lieutenants, chapter masters, whatever it might be. Whereas in the 1,000 and 2,000 points, I'm going for the Ferryman detachment, and that's because we're including a Blight Spawn with Revolting Stench Vat. So there is a Ferryman strat to increase that to a 12-inch aura of you don't count as fight first, you don't count as charging for any rules purposes that unit may have. So I think switching to the Ferryman for 1,000 points and 2,000 is a solid pick here. So once again, we've got HQ, we have got 4 troops choices, 1 elite choice, and 2 fast attack. So the troops is the compulsory. We've got the Malignant Plaguecaster, same spells, same Acidic Malady, just no Gloaming Blow because we're Ferryman now. We've got 2 5-mans, exactly the same reason as previous. They're playing the game, they're holding those 2 closest objectives, and they're spreading the sickness, so our 10-man squads are freed up to get on with what they need to do. We've then got two 10-man squads, so we've got one additional 10-man squad, and that allows us to either push 20 Plague Marines towards a central objective, or perhaps spread out and look to pressure on two separate fronts. Again, the 10-man squads are laid out in exactly the same way. We've got a Foul Blight Spawn with Viscous Death for re-rolling the number of hits on that auto-hitting Flamer, and of course it puts it up to Strength 8, which is a very nice place to be, and of course a CP spent here for Revolting Stenchvat to give that aura, which we're then going to buff. Now, I could get behind giving the Arch Contaminator Warlord trait here to the Blight Spawn. I was on the fence as to whether to include it here, but I think there's definitely the argument to be made. If you want to include Arch Contaminator, whether it's on the Plague Caster, whether it's on the Blight Spawn, you've got plenty of plague weapons to make use of it, and I think you will see some value there. And then in the fast attack, we've got two Flesh Mower Bloat Drones coming in at 115 points each, now that that is a free upgrade. So once again, I think at 1,000 points, we're definitely looking to spread the sickness. We've got the two 5-man units that can cheaply look to win us some primary points and win us some secondary points on spread the sickness. At 1,000 points, Fleeing Vectors becomes more relevant. We're more likely to see 10-man squads where we could get all 7 model kills in a single activation, but we're also more likely to see larger squads that might end up failing morale. So Fleeing Vectors does become more interesting. If it's more of an MSU squad sort of build, 5-man squads or whatever the minimum is, then you may again switch to a grind, because the fact that you'll probably be killing with Plague Marines some of the time will generate you some CP. And again, there's some 10-mans. The bloat drones are very tanky. In theory, your 5-mans are going to be hidden as best as possible, and your characters are going to be lookout surd. So they're in the position where they're either going to have to kill drones or kill Plague Marine 10-man squads, which, especially if they've got the Miasma and Putrescent on them, are not the easiest things to remove. So again, grind feels like a reasonable pick. Engage is perhaps more relevant here at 500 than 1,000, just because you've got more units available, more chances of getting into opponents' quarters, and we've got drones which can fly. If they get a good advance, they're going anywhere between 11 and 16 inches. So ultimately, they could look to score us some engage. I don't particularly like behind enemy lines for this list, but you could certainly run it. You've got free reserves now, so you could always reserve one of those 5-mans depending on the map and look to bring that in from turn 3 onwards, because of course you can reinforce into the opponent's deployment zone from turn 3 onwards, but you need to be aware of which edge is the opponent's board edge, because you can't come in 6 inches off of that, and that does allow them to screen out the edge that you would come in on rather than that one, because it's not a deep strike. It is a reinforcement from a board edge if we're talking about Plague Marines. So I don't particularly like behind enemy lines here either. I would, as a game plan, sort of in advance be thinking spread the sickness, fleeing or grind, and then, if an assassinate presents itself, that could be reasonable. Otherwise, we may go for a despoiled grounds and just think, we'll have just a win more option. If I get tabled, then I was never getting anything on despoiled. And if I am ahead on the board and I can play cagey and hide and just pick the engagements I want because of that Blight Spawn turning off charge effects for opponents, then you could perhaps look to tip the balance later in the game and just hoard some points, maybe 6 to 9 points on despoiled grounds. Again, I don't particularly like the Psychic secondaries anymore. Warp Ritual's not bad, but with just the one Psyker, the idea here is that those buffs go on a 10-man squad. I don't want to give those up. But in a certain matchup where, let's say the opponent has a lot of Strength 4 and Strength 8, where being at T6 doesn't change anything, then we might consider, there's some dense, I can get -1 off that, so I'm not going to need Miasma or Putrescent, so I will go for a Warp Ritual in that scenario. But my primary game plan for secondaries with these would be spread, grind and fleeing, and then maybe a despoiled, maybe an engage. And then with the 2,000 point list, so again, all the same units, largely included in the same ways. We are still the Ferryman. We've got a Malignant Plaguecaster, again, Miasma Pestilence, Putrescent Vitality. Got 2 5-man Plague Marine squads. Again, they're playing the primary, playing the Spread the Sickness. We've got 4 10-man Plague Marine squads. So again, they're going to be pushing out and looking to deal the damage. We've got more in the elite slot this time. So we've got the Foul Blight Spawn again with Revolting Stench Vats and Viscous Death. I've also gone with a Biologus Putrefier because with this amount of Plague Marine bodies, upgrading to Hyper Blight Grenades, opening up the Blightning stratagem as a very effective way of dealing with things that are already in engagement in the shooting phase, can be very potent. Of course, bear in mind the Malignant Plaguecaster has Blight Grenades as well, so he would get the upgrade too. I believe the Blightspawn does, but he's also got his named grenade and his sprayer, so yes, he does. But more often than not, you're not going to turn down using the sprayer just to throw a grenade with the Blightspawn. Now, again, you could slap Arch Contaminator on the Blightspawn. When I've got the Putrefier in there, I like to have it on the Putrefier just so that if you lose one of those characters, you've not lost both your Warlord traits or Warlord trait and Relic auras in the same body if it's all on the Blightspawn. Although the Blightspawn makes people fight last, at 2,000 points, you're more likely to get something in there that you can't deal with. And the Foul Blight Spawn isn't going to kill stuff in melee, even though he makes it fight last. So if he gets tagged up, you're very likely to be losing him if it's any sort of threatening melee unit. Filling out the rest of the elite slot, the Death Shroud Terminators. I've gone with 2 squads of 3 here. Now this is to open up behind enemy lines. 3-man units. They don't have a particularly big footprint despite the size of the base. So those guys are in there to allow you to take behind enemy lines. We'll come back to that. They, of course, have their 2 Plague Spurt Gauntlets on the Champ and the Chimes of Contagion, now that that's free. In the fast attack, we've gone with 3 Boat Drones with Flesh Mowers. And then in the heavy support, we've gone with 1 Plague Burst Crawler with Entropy Cannons, and I've picked a Heavy Slugger. If you prefer the Rot Hail, that's fair enough. It's all the same cost. So again, we've got many of the units in here for the same reasons. The 2 5-mans, playing the primary, playing the Spread the Sickness. The 4 10-mans allow us to run 20 Plague Marines up the middle and 2 sets of 10 out to flanks. On maps where we're sort of playing long ways up the board, then you might well sort of march them up all together, and whatever the opponent targets, you will just sort of pivot to make sure your characters are still lookout surd. When we're talking about having 4 Plague Marine squads out in the open marching up towards the opponent, Miasma and Putrescent Vitality become that bit less relevant from a defensive perspective because the opponent can just pick to shoot at a different unit. If they are the only unit on an objective, then it's more relevant to cast those spells because that's the unit the opponent doesn't still want you to have when your turn starts because you'll score for your primary in the command phase. But outside of that, if you're not going to have just one unit on an objective or everybody's just out in the open, bear in mind your opponent can just pick a different unit, and you might want to consider a Warp Ritual on the grounds that your Miasma and your Putrescent Vitality are going to lose value because your opponent can just ignore that unit this turn. But yeah, the 4 10-mans, of course, the full OBSEC, they're pretty tough. Not the toughest thing in the game, but still pretty tough. And as we've said, whatever it is that's in that area of the board that they're going to need to deal with, you can just remove the models that don't have a good profile into it. Once you start to get close, you can remove the guns and just keep your cleavers, your flails, whatever's going to be the most potent into those enemy units. As we've said, the Death Shroud are there to threaten behind enemy lines. It's 4 points a turn if you can strike those in, so you only really need to start striking in from turn 3 to get the 12. Obviously, if you can strike into their deployment zone from turn 2, you could max out at 15, but you're also there for longer, more likely the opponent can dedicate something to killing them. You may then lose some of the point output you'd get for behind enemy lines, but if they're turning around to dedicate killing Death Shroud, then they're not shooting at your Plague Marines in front, and so you leave your opponent in this weird position of, do I push out and deal with the Plague Marine threat and try and counter on primary because we've spread out across 4 objectives or potentially more at this point? Whereas the alternative is they stay back and shield you out of behind enemy lines, try and deal with the Plague Marines at range, which, if the terrain supports you being obscured while still on objective, might not even be an option. And as a result, there's no good play. If they come out of their deployment zone, they let you drop in and score 4 points a turn with your Death Shroud and a unit that's going to creep towards their home objective and will very easily deal with a cheap backline unit. One of the reasons we have Plague Marines in the backline rather than some Poxwalkers is specifically because those Plague Marines will hold up under some kind of fire, some kind of melee onslaught, where Poxwalkers, in my opinion, fall flat these days. There's a lot of quality output, like high number of attack units, whether it's shooting, whether it's melee, and Poxwalkers just fall flat to any sort of weight of dice, where Plague Marines, particularly if they're getting cover against shooting, don't necessarily fall flat, and in fact could just weather the blow. So those Death Shroud coming in at the back will be able to overcome a typical backline cheap unit, and if it's not a typical backline cheap unit, they're using something expensive to hold that back objective and try and screen you out, then you're only dedicating 300 points to scoring points, sneaking in, and getting them to alter their game plan, which is well worth 300 points in my opinion. On top of that, we've got a Plague Burst Crawler in this 2,000 point list because that mortar offers us some out of line of sight with really good range. Pretty much anywhere you put it on the board, it's going to be able to out of line of sight their home objective. And as a result, let's say they've got the 5-man and the string being in it out just to keep the 9-inch completely, keep you out of the board. All it takes is a model or two lost from that unit, and now they've got to choose, do I want to be on the objective or do I want to screen you out? Obviously, they want to be on the objective or they're giving away primary, and now they give up the behind enemy lines. It's not foolproof. The Plague Burst Crawler, of course, you're going to be -1 ballistic skill for being out of line of sight. They could -1 you. There's all sorts of things that could come up. It's only AP2. You're going to lose one of that because of being out of line of sight. So again, it's by no means a guarantee to kill anything, but if you get a good hit roll off, the wound roll is obviously going to be very good because it's strength 8 and you can reroll ones to wound. So chances are, over a couple of turns, by the time you want to bring those Death Shroud in, that mortar may have done the work needed just to put your opponent in that really uncomfortable spot where behind enemy lines is a given now. They can't screen out the Death Shroud, and now their choices are, can we actually deal with these Plague Marines in shooting, or do we have to charge? And if we have to charge, we're just going to be giving up, getting hit in the face, because we've got that Foul Blight spawn with that massive 12-inch aura, because we're spending a CP every turn on the Ferryman strat. So all in all, again, I don't particularly like playing a Psychic secondary with this. I like having the Miasma and the Putrescent. But again, we've got that many units out there. If we are planning to throw out all 3 drones, again, one with 1 10-man on the left, one with 1 10-man on the right, one with a 2 10-mans, and the characters up the middle, ultimately, there's support there in terms of heroic interventions from the drones. The Plague Burst doesn't need to come out and really threaten any of the wide objectives. It can use its entropy cannons to try and pick off a big monster or vehicle. D3+3 damage when it gets through is very nice. And then, of course, the mortar can just be dedicated to backline pressure because the Plague Marines can generally hold their own against a wide variety of targets, both with a bit of shooting and with the melee profiles they have. So they are my picks. As I say, I don't expect them to be considered a top competitive list, the most competitive, but the reason that I've put them together, the mindset when I've put them together, is what secondaries are we playing, what sort of questions are we asking the opponent, and what units allow us to really twist the knife in the opponent when it comes to playing out the primary and those secondaries. The answer in all cases is Plague Marines as number 1, Bloat Drones as number 2 because they open up battlefield supremacy secondaries, and also the Death Shroud because they open particularly behind enemy lines to us if we're talking about 3-man squads. Well, I've waffled on long enough there. Thank you all so much for listening. If you've got anything to add, if you want to share your list, whatever it might be, I'd be quite happy to get involved in the comments, so please do feel free to continue the discussion. But either way around, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time in the Underhive.